Samantha never expected to meet him. She hadn't been looking for anything, or anyone. At 31, her life was mostly settled. She was married, comfortably if not happily, to a man who had once been her best friend but had gradually become more of a stranger. The passion had faded in their marriage, replaced by a quiet, polite companionship that left her longing for something more, though she wasn't sure what that more was. Her job at the architectural firm had provided the distraction she needed. As a project manager, she threw herself into her work, channeling the frustrations of her stagnant personal life into long hours at the office and managing difficult clients. It was during one of these projects, an extensive redesign of a historic building downtown, that she met Peter. Peter was 48, a well-respected architect who had been brought in as a consultant for the project. From the moment Samantha saw him, she felt an electric pull she couldn't explain. His presence filled the room, tall, broad-shouldered, with salt and pepper hair and piercing gray eyes that seemed to see right through her. He was confident without being arrogant, his voice smooth and commanding, and his knowledge of design was as impressive as his physical presence. Their first meeting was professional, as it should have been. Samantha kept her distance, hiding the strange flutter in her chest every time his gaze lingered on her a second too long. She reminded herself that she was married, and so was he. Peter had mentioned his wife casually during their initial conversations, in the way people do when they're making small talk. But there was something in the way he looked at her that made Samantha feel as though there was more behind his calm exterior. Something unspoken. As the weeks passed and the project progressed, their interactions became more frequent. What had started as professional exchanges about design plans and budget constraints slowly shifted into something deeper. They found reasons to meet alone, under the pretense of discussing work, though their conversations often strayed far from the project. They talked about their lives, their pasts, their hopes and disappointments. It was as if they were peeling away the layers of their professional facades, exposing the vulnerability beneath. One late evening, as they sat in the empty conference room reviewing blueprints, the conversation turned to their marriages. The soft glow of the desk lamp cast shadows across Peter's face, highlighting the sharp lines of his jaw and the weariness in his eyes. "I think we both know this job isn't what's keeping us here so late," Peter said, his voice low, almost a whisper. Samantha's heart skipped a beat, but she forced herself to stay composed. "What do you mean?" Peter leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "I think you know exactly what I mean." She swallowed hard, feeling the tension between them rise like a tidal wave. She had been avoiding this moment, pretending that the connection they shared was harmless, that it was simply the result of spending too much time together. But now, faced with the undeniable truth of it, she couldn't hide anymore. "You're married," she said softly, though the words felt hollow even as they left her lips. "So are you," he replied, his gaze unwavering. Silence hung between them, heavy with unspoken desire. Samantha felt her pulse quicken, her breath shallow as Peter's eyes searched hers. The air in the room seemed to thicken, charged with something electric and dangerous. "I'm not sure this is a good idea," she whispered, though every fiber of her being ached to close the distance between them. Peter stood slowly, walking around the table until he was standing in front of her. He didn't touch her, but the closeness of his body sent a shiver down her spine. He reached out, his fingers gently brushing a strand of hair from her face, his touch light but enough to make her skin burn with longing. "I don't think we get to choose this," he said quietly, his voice filled with a raw vulnerability that surprised her. Samantha looked up at him, her mind racing with the weight of the decision before her. She knew this was dangerous, that crossing this line would change everything. But in that moment, the pull of desire outweighed the voice of reason in her head. Without thinking, she stood, closing the gap between them, her lips meeting his in a kiss that was both tender and urgent. Peter's arms wrapped around her, pulling her closer as the kiss deepened, the tension that had been building between them for weeks finally erupting into something undeniable. Samantha's body melted into his, her hands tangling in his hair as their kiss grew more desperate, more hungry. It was as if the world outside that conference room ceased to exist, and all that mattered was the way Peter made her feel. Alive, desired, wanted. They pulled apart, both of them breathless, their foreheads resting against each other as they struggled to regain control. "We can't do this," Samantha whispered, though even as she said the words, she knew she didn't mean them. "I know," Peter replied, his voice thick with emotion. "But I don't want to stop." Neither did she. In that moment, all the reasons they shouldn't be together, his wife, her husband, the potential fallout, seemed insignificant compared to the fire that burned between them. What followed was a whirlwind of stolen moments and secret rendezvous. They found excuses to meet outside of work, always under the guise of discussing the project, though their conversations rarely touched on blueprints or design plans anymore. Their affair was passionate, filled with the kind of intensity that Samantha hadn't felt in years. With Peter, she rediscovered a part of herself she had long thought dead. The part that craved excitement, intimacy, and the thrill of something forbidden. But as their relationship deepened, so did the guilt. Every time she returned home to her husband, Mark, the weight of her betrayal pressed down on her like a lead blanket. Mark wasn't a bad man. He was kind, dependable, and loved her in his own quiet way. But their marriage had become a shadow of what it once was, and Samantha couldn't help but feel that she had simply been going through the motions for years. The guilt gnawed at her, but it wasn't enough to stop. The connection she shared with Peter was unlike anything she had ever experienced, and even though she knew it was wrong, she couldn't bring herself to walk away. She told herself that no one was getting hurt, that as long as she kept their affair a secret, it wasn't really hurting anyone. But deep down, she knew she was lying to herself. One evening, after yet another stolen encounter with Peter, Samantha returned home to find Mark sitting on the couch, a glass of whiskey in his hand. His eyes were dark, filled with an emotion she couldn't quite place. "We need to talk," he said, his voice unusually calm. Samantha's heart skipped a beat. She set her bag down, her hands trembling as she sat across from him. "What's going on?" Mark took a sip of his whiskey, his eyes never leaving hers. "I've noticed you've been distant lately." Samantha felt her pulse quicken, her stomach churning with guilt. She opened her mouth to respond, but Mark held up a hand, stopping her. "I'm not accusing you of anything," he said softly. "I just want to know, are you happy?" The question hit her like a punch to the gut. Was she happy? The answer should have been simple, but it wasn't. In some ways, yes, she was happier than she had been in years, but that happiness was tied to Peter, not Mark. And that realization made her heart ache. I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark sighed, his shoulders slumping as he leaned back on the couch. "I've been thinking a lot about us lately," he said quietly. "About our marriage, about where we are. And I can't help but feel like we've lost something." Tears welled in Samantha's eyes as she listened to her husband's words, the guilt she had been trying to suppress crashing over her like a tidal wave. She had been so caught up in her affair with Peter that she hadn't stopped to consider what it was doing to her marriage, to the man she had once loved with all her heart. "I don't want to lose you," Mark said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I also don't want to keep pretending that everything's fine when it's not." Samantha wiped at her tears, her heart breaking as she realized how much she had hurt him. She wanted to tell him the truth, to confess everything and beg for his forgiveness. But the words caught in her throat, the fear of what would happen if she told him the truth paralyzing her. Instead, she reached for his hand, her voice trembling as she said, "I'm so sorry, Mark." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and hope. "Can we fix this?" he asked softly. Samantha's heart ached with the weight of his question. Could they fix this? Could they go back to the way things were before? Or had she destroyed everything with her betrayal? She didn't know the answer, and that terrified her. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "But I want to try." Samantha tried to distance herself from Peter after that conversation with Mark. She threw herself into her marriage, trying to rekindle the spark that had once been there. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't stop thinking about Peter. The pull between them was too strong, and despite her best efforts, they continued to meet in secret, their passion only growing more intense with each encounter. The affair became harder to hide as time went on. The lies piled up, the guilt weighing heavier on her heart with each passing day. She knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down, but she couldn't bring herself to stop. Peter had become an addiction, and no matter how much it hurt, she couldn't quit him. One evening, as they lay tangled in each other's arms in a hotel room just outside the city, Peter turned to her. His eyes filled with a sadness she hadn't seen before. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," he said quietly. Samantha's heart clenched in her chest. "What do you mean?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I love you, Samantha. I think I've loved you from the moment I met you. But this isn't sustainable. We can't keep sneaking around like this." She felt a lump form in her throat, her mind racing with the implications of his words. "What are you saying?" Peter looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and pain. "I'm saying that I want more. I want to be with you, really be with you. But I can't do that while we're both still married." Samantha's breath caught in her throat, the weight of his words pressing down on her like a ton of bricks. She had known this moment would come, but she hadn't been prepared for it. Peter was asking her to choose between him and Mark, between the life she had built and the life she could have. Tears welled in her eyes as she realized the impossible choice she was being forced to make. She loved Peter, but she also loved Mark in her own way. How could she choose between them? How could she walk away from the man who had stood by her for years, who had built a life with her, even if that life had lost its spark? But how could she walk away from Peter, the man who made her feel alive again, who had reignited a fire in her that she thought had long since burned out? Samantha's heart raced as she looked into Peter's eyes, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. "I don't know what to do," she whispered, her voice trembling. Peter reached for her hand, his touch gentle but firm. "I don't want to pressure you," he said softly, "but I need to know where we stand. I need to know if we have a future together." Samantha's mind raced as she tried to process his words. She felt torn between two worlds, two loves, and no matter which path she chose, someone would get hurt. Samantha felt the weight of Peter's words pressing on her chest like a heavy stone. Her mind was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts, emotions crashing against each other in a storm of guilt, desire, and fear. How could she make this decision? How could she choose between the life she had built with Mark, a life filled with comfort and security, and the passion, the fire, she had found with Peter, the man who made her feel alive again? She had never imagined she would be in this position, pulled between two men who each held a piece of her heart. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "Peter, I don't know if I can leave Mark. I don't even know if I want to. It's not that simple." Peter's hand tightened around hers, the sadness in his eyes deepening. "I know it's not simple, but what we're doing isn't fair to anyone. Not to your husband, not to my wife, and not to us." The mention of his wife sent a fresh wave of guilt crashing over Samantha. She had tried to avoid thinking about Peter's marriage, about the woman who had shared his life for years. But the truth was unavoidable. They were both betraying the people they had once vowed to love forever. The weight of that betrayal was suffocating. "I know," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper, "but I don't know how to end this. I don't know if I can." Peter looked at her, his expression filled with a mixture of love and sorrow. "I can't keep living like this, Samantha. I want to be with you, but not like this. Not in secret. I need to know if you're willing to take that step." Samantha's heart ached as she looked into his eyes, feeling the enormity of the decision before her. How could she choose? How could she give up one part of her life without losing herself in the process? "I need time," she said softly, her voice trembling with uncertainty. "I need to think." Peter nodded, though the pain in his eyes was clear. "I understand," he said quietly, his hand gently squeezing hers. "But I can't wait forever." The rest of the evening passed in a blur, their usual intimacy overshadowed by the weight of the conversation they had just shared. Samantha left the hotel feeling hollow, as if a piece of her had been left behind in that room. She drove home in silence, the city lights blurring in her vision as tears welled in her eyes. When she arrived home, Mark was sitting at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a mug of tea. His face lit up when he saw her, though there was a hint of concern in his eyes. "Hey," he said softly, his voice filled with warmth. "How was your meeting?" Samantha's throat tightened as she forced a smile, the guilt threatening to overwhelm her. "It was fine," she replied, her voice barely audible. Mark stood and walked over to her, wrapping his arms around her in a gentle embrace. "You've been working so hard lately," he murmured, his breath warm against her hair. "I miss you." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. How could he say that? How could he still love her, still want her, when she was betraying him every time she walked out the door to meet Peter? "I miss you too," she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. Mark pulled back slightly, his brow furrowed in concern. "Are you okay?" he asked gently, his hand brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You seem distant." Samantha swallowed hard, her heart aching with the weight of the secret she was keeping. She wanted to tell him the truth, to lay everything out in the open and beg for his forgiveness. But the fear of losing him, of losing the stability and security of their life together, kept the words trapped in her throat. "I'm just tired," she said quietly, avoiding his gaze. "It's been a long day." Mark studied her for a moment, as if sensing that there was more beneath the surface, but he didn't push. Instead, he kissed her forehead and pulled her into another embrace. "I love you," he whispered. Samantha's heart shattered at his words. She had been so caught up in her affair with Peter that she hadn't realized just how much she was hurting Mark, the man who had been by her side for years, who had loved her through every challenge, every moment of doubt. How had she let it get to this point? "I love you too," she whispered, though the words felt hollow in her mouth. The days that followed were a blur of conflicting emotions. Samantha tried to distance herself from Peter, throwing herself into her work and her marriage, trying to reignite the spark that had once existed between her and Mark. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't stop thinking about Peter. His touch, his voice, the way he made her feel like the most important person in the world. The passion they shared was unlike anything she had ever experienced, and the thought of losing that terrified her. But the guilt was becoming unbearable. Every time she looked at Mark, she saw the trust in his eyes, the love he still had for her, and it made her feel sick to her stomach. She knew she couldn't keep living this double life, couldn't keep lying to the man who had given her everything. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Mark reached for her hand, his expression serious. "Samantha, we need to talk," he said quietly. Her heart skipped a beat, her mind racing with the fear that he had found out about her affair. But when she looked into his eyes, she saw only concern. "I've been thinking a lot lately," Mark continued, his voice steady but soft. "About us. About our marriage." Samantha's throat tightened as she waited for him to continue, her stomach churning with guilt. "I know things haven't been easy," he said slowly. "And I know I've been distant at times. But I want to fix that. I want us to be happy again the way we used to be." Tears welled in Samantha's eyes as she listened to his words, her heart breaking with the realization of how much she had hurt him. Mark still loved her, still wanted to fight for their marriage, even after everything she had done. "I don't want to lose you," Mark said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I need to know if you still want this, if you still want us." Samantha's chest tightened as she looked into her husband's eyes, seeing the vulnerability, the hope, the love that still burned within him. How could she have been so blind? How could she have let things get this far? "I do want us," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "But I've made so many mistakes, Mark. I don't even know where to start." Mark's brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" Samantha wiped at her tears, her heart pounding in her chest as she prepared herself for the confession she had been avoiding for so long. She couldn't keep lying, couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. "I've been seeing someone else," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "I've been having an affair." The silence that followed was deafening. Mark stared at her, his face pale, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. "What?" he whispered, his voice shaking. You've been?" Tears streamed down Samantha's face as she nodded, her heart breaking at the sight of the pain in his eyes. "I'm so sorry," she sobbed. "I never wanted to hurt you. I don't even know how it happened. I got lost." Mark stood abruptly, his hands shaking as he raked them through his hair. He paced the room, his breaths coming in short, ragged gasps as he tried to process what she had just told him. "How long?" he demanded, his voice rising. "How long has this been going on?" Samantha wiped at her tears, her stomach churning with guilt and shame. "A few months," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark let out a bitter laugh, his face contorted with pain. "A few months," he repeated, his voice filled with disbelief. I can't believe this." He turned to face her, his eyes blazing with anger and hurt. "How could you do this to me, Samantha? After everything we've been through? How could you betray me like this?" "I'm sorry," she sobbed, her heart breaking with every word. "I never meant for this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you." Mark shook his head, his face a mask of pain and disbelief. "But you did," he snapped. "You betrayed me. You lied to me. And now what? You expect me to just forgive you and move on?" Samantha's heart ached with the weight of her guilt, her chest tightening with the knowledge that she had destroyed the one thing she had thought would always be there, her marriage. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I don't know if we can fix this, but I want to try." Mark stared at her for a long moment, his chest heaving with emotion. Finally, he shook his head, his face hardening with resolve. "I don't know if I can forgive you," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "But I need time. I need time to figure out if I even want to." And with that, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving Samantha alone with the crushing weight of her choices. Samantha collapsed onto the couch, her body trembling with the weight of what had just happened. She had known this moment would come eventually, but she hadn't expected it to feel so devastating. The look in Mark's eyes, the betrayal, the anger, the hurt, was etched into her mind, and she wondered if she would ever be able to erase it. For hours she sat in silence, staring blankly at the wall as the reality of her situation sank in. She had confessed her affair to Mark, and now she had no idea what would happen next. Would he leave her? Would he ever be able to forgive her? And even if he did, could their marriage survive something like this? She thought about Peter, the man who had turned her world upside down. What had started as an intense, all-consuming passion had spiraled into something she could no longer control. She had fallen for him hard and fast, but now she was left standing in the wreckage of her life, unsure of what to do next. The following days passed in a fog. Mark had stayed with a friend, leaving the house eerily quiet and empty. Samantha barely ate, barely slept, consumed by the guilt that gnawed at her insides. She couldn't get the image of Mark's face out of her mind, couldn't shake the feeling that she had destroyed something that could never be rebuilt. She tried to reach out to him, sending texts, leaving voicemails, but he didn't respond. The silence was unbearable, a constant reminder of the damage she had done. She wanted to tell him that she was sorry, that she regretted everything, but she knew that words alone wouldn't be enough. A week later, Mark finally returned home. Samantha had been sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at her untouched cup of coffee when she heard the front door open. Her heart leaped in her chest and she quickly stood, her hands trembling as she braced herself for whatever was about to come. Mark walked in, his face expressionless as he set his keys down on the counter. He didn't look at her, didn't say a word as he moved to the other side of the room. "Mark," Samantha began, her voice shaky, unsure of how to begin. He held up a hand, cutting her off. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he said quietly, his voice flat. "And I think we both need some space." Samantha's heart sank. "What do you mean?" Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair as he leaned against the counter. "I can't just pretend that everything's fine," he said, his voice laced with pain. "What you did, it hurt me, Samantha. It hurt me more than I can even put into words. And I need time to figure out if I can move past that." Tears welled in her eyes as she listened to his words, the weight of her actions pressing down on her like a heavy burden. "I'm so sorry, Mark," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I never wanted to hurt you. I don't know what I was thinking. I got lost." Mark looked at her, his expression filled with a mixture of sadness and anger. "I trusted you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I believed in us. And you threw that away for what? For someone else? For some fling?" "It wasn't just a fling," Samantha admitted, her heart breaking as the truth tumbled out of her. "I cared about him, Mark. But I care about you too. I don't know how to explain it." Mark's jaw tightened, and he turned away from her, running a hand over his face. "I don't even know if I want to hear it," he muttered. "I don't know if I can even look at you right now." Samantha's chest tightened, her tears flowing freely as she stood there, helpless. She had never seen Mark like this before, so broken, so defeated. It was as if the man she had known for years had been replaced by a stranger. I think we need to take some time apart, Mark said after a long pause, his voice devoid of emotion. I need to figure out if I can forgive you. And you need to figure out what you really want. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She had known this might happen, but hearing it out loud made it all too real. Her marriage, her life with Mark, was hanging by a thread, and there was nothing she could do to stop it from unraveling. Is that really what you want? Samantha asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark's eyes softened for a moment, but the pain was still there, lurking just beneath the surface. I don't know what I want anymore, he admitted. But I know I can't be here right now. With that, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving Samantha standing there, her heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. Weeks passed, and Samantha and Mark's separation became more formal. They rarely spoke, and when they did, it was brief and strained. Mark had moved in with a friend, leaving Samantha alone in the house they had shared for years. The emptiness was suffocating, and she found herself drowning in a sea of guilt and regret. She hadn't seen Peter since that night in the hotel, and though she missed him, the weight of everything she had lost was too overwhelming for her to even think about reaching out to him. She knew that their affair had caused this destruction, and no matter how much she had cared for him, she couldn't bring herself to continue down that path. But Peter hadn't given up. One evening, as Samantha sat on the back porch, staring out at the darkening sky, her phone buzzed with a message. She glanced at the screen, her heart skipping a beat when she saw Peter's name. I miss you. Can we talk? Samantha's chest tightened as she stared at the message, her mind racing with indecision. She had spent weeks trying to distance herself from Peter, trying to rebuild some semblance of the life she had with Mark. But now, with his message sitting on her screen, the pull of him was as strong as ever. After a long moment, she typed out a response, her hands trembling. I don't think that's a good idea. Peter's reply came almost immediately. I need to see you. Please. Samantha closed her eyes, her mind filled with memories of their time together. The passion, the excitement, the way he made her feel alive again. But those memories were tainted now, overshadowed by the pain she had caused Mark and the wreckage of her marriage. I can't, she typed, her heart aching as she pressed send. For several minutes there was no response. And then finally her phone buzzed again. I'm sorry, Peter's message read. I miss you. Samantha stared at the message, tears welling in her eyes. She missed him too, but she knew that continuing their relationship would only lead to more heartache. She had to make a choice, and this time she knew what the right choice was. With trembling hands, she typed out one final message. Goodbye, Peter. She set her phone down, wiping at her tears as the reality of what she had just done settled over her. She had ended it, finally, for good. And now, all that was left was to pick up the pieces of her shattered life.